Alright, so for this section of the course, we will be discussing Excel's PowerPivot add-in. And before we jump in and start using this add-in inside of Excel, I briefly want to discuss what PowerPivot is and what it can allow us to do. And hopefully, once we start using the PowerPivot tool within our spreadsheet, you will have a better understanding of what we are trying to accomplish. So first, let's define what PowerPivot is. PowerPivot is a data modeling technology that lets you create data models, establish relationships, and create calculations. So what is a data model? Well, a data model allows us to integrate data from multiple tables, meaning that if we have multiple tables of data, we can create relationships between these tables to create a more sophisticated report. And using data models within PowerPivot enables us to work with larger sets of data. For example, in an Excel spreadsheet, we are limited to just a little bit over 1 million rows of data. And depending on the size of our data, Excel can really struggle and slow down once it gets over a certain amount of rows. But with PowerPivot, we can work beyond this limitation. So we can have even more than 1 million rows of data. And even then, we will still be able to produce smaller, leaner, and faster workbooks. Because with the data model, our data is not actually on a separate Excel worksheet. Instead, we are loading this data into the internal data model of the Excel PowerPivot tool. So with all that being said, I'm going to explain what the PowerPivot tool can allow us to do. So in the next few videos, we will be working with 3 separate data sets. We have the sales data, the customer data, and the product data. And inside these data sets have different types of data inside them. And if we tried to build a single report off these 3 data sets, we would manually have to combine all the data into one data set. And sometimes that's impossible to do. But with the PowerPivot tool, we can create relationships between these data sets. And to create these relationships, these data sets need to have unique identifiers, meaning that somewhere in our data sets, they share a similar column. And if our data sets have these unique identifiers, we can establish links between these data sets to create a relationship. And if we are able to link these data sets together, we can create a more detailed and sophisticated single report without merging these 3 separate data sets into one. So for example, if the sales data shares a unique identifier with the product data, we can pull data from both of these data sets and then use that data in our report. Well, this may or may not make sense at the moment, but hopefully once we start working with the PowerPivot tool, you'll get a better understanding of how we can create these relationships and analyze data from multiple tables. So before we actually start using the Excel PowerPivot add-in, the first thing that we have to do is activate this add-in so we can access the PowerPivot tool. And I also want to point out for the rest of this section, we are going to be working inside a new Excel workbook. So if you haven't done so, you can go ahead and open up a new workbook. But make sure you save the current progress we have made in the other Excel practice file, because we will be returning to that practice file when we get to other sections of the course. So what we have to do is come up to the File tab, and then click Options at the bottom of your screen, and then we can select Add-ins. And down here in this Manage box, we can select this drop-down, and then we need to click on COM Add-ins. And then if we click Go, we can check the box labeled Microsoft PowerPivot for Excel. And then we can click OK. Now if you notice, we have a new tab in our ribbon labeled PowerPivot. And if we give this a click, now we have access to different PowerPivot tools. So now that we have the PowerPivot add-in activated, we are ready to start creating our first data model and create relationships between our data tables. Alright, now that we have the PowerPivot add-in activated, it's time to create our first data model. And if you haven't done so already, please make sure to download the PowerPivot Data Tables Excel file from the resources, because that's the file we are going to create the connection to for our data model. So to import data into our data model, what we have to do is come up to the PowerPivot tab, and we have a few options. For example, if we had a list of data within this workbook itself, we could click anywhere inside the dataset and then select Add to Data Model. But since we are going to connect from another source, what we have to do is click Manage. And this will open up the PowerPivot window. And within the Get External Data group, we have multiple options on how to retrieve our data. We can import our data from a database, like Microsoft Access, or from other sources. So if we give this button a click, we can see all the sources that we can choose from to connect our data. And since we are trying to connect to a different Excel file, we can scroll down this list and select Excel file. And then if we click Next, we need to tell Excel where this file is saved on our computer. So we can come up to Browse, then locate where you saved the PowerPivot Data Tables file. Mine is just on my desktop, and then we can just click this file and select Open. Now within that PowerPivot Data Tables file, there are 3 separate sheet tabs, and each sheet contains a separate table. And in those tables, we do have column headers. So we want to make sure that we select Use the first row as column headers. And then we can click Next. Now our import wizard can see that there's 3 different sheet tabs within that Excel file that have data in it. And we want to select all these tables, so we can select this checkbox at the top to select all the tables and click Finish. And then if we close out of this, now we successfully loaded these tables into our data model. So we have our customer data, our product data, and then our sales data. Now that we have these tables within our data model, it's time to link these tables to create relationships. And the easiest way to establish these connections is to change our view. So if we come up to the top here, we can see that we are in the data view. But let's change this to the diagram view. Now it shows us our 3 separate tables and the column headers within those tables. Now the sales data is a little bit cut off, but we can select this table and drag down to resize. So really quickly, let's go back to our data view and take a look at the data within these tables and see what we are missing from one table that we could get from another. So let's go back up to data view and select our sales data. So in our sales table, we have order ID, the date, the customer ID, product ID, the unit sold, and the total sales. So what if we wanted to get the name of the customer that bought a product? Well, in this sales table, we have a customer ID. And if we go to our customer table, it also has a customer ID, but then it has the customer name, city, and the phone number for that customer. So these 2 tables share a unique identifier, which is the customer ID. So let's go back up to our diagram view, and I'm going to move these tables around a bit by clicking on the name of the table and dragging it to where we want it to be placed. So to connect the sales table to the customer table, we need to grab that unique identifier, which is the customer ID, and we can just click and drag to the customer ID in the customer table. And that's it. Now we have established that connection. Now let's establish a connection between the sales table and the product table. Let's go back to the data view and then click on the sales table. And then we need to find a unique identifier that the sales table and the product table share. So in the sales table, we have this product ID column. But what is this product? We just know that it's P801 or P301. What's the name of the product? What's the unit price for this product? Well, if we select our product table, we have the product ID, the product name, and the unit price. So the unique identifier that these two tables share is the product ID. And if we go back to our diagram view, we can select the product ID in the sales table and then click and drag to the product ID in the product table. Now that we have established these connections, we can go back into Excel and create a pivot table to build a report that can include all the data from these three separate data tables. Okay, so now that we have our three separate data tables connected inside of our data model, we can report off this data model by creating a pivot table. So inside of our PowerPivot window, we can select Pivot Table. And then we can either insert this pivot table on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. I'm going to click Existing, and then we have the option to select the cell within our worksheet of where we want to insert our pivot table. So instead of cell A1, we can click this little graphic off to the right and select a different cell that we want to insert our pivot table in. I'm going to select cell B3 and then click OK. OK again. And now we have inserted our pivot table. And then over here to the right, inside of our pivot table window, it's a little bit different than what we're used to. Because previously, when we were just working with one data set, we could only select the fields within that data set. But now that we have three different data tables, we can select different fields within each one of these. So for example, if I click the drop down for sales data, we can see all the columns within that table. And then if we expand the product data, we can select those columns as well. So let's pretend we only had one data set in our pivot table. And let's say that we only had the sales data. And if our goal was to see the total amount of sales for each product ID, we could select the total sales, which it automatically put in the values area and sum those cells because this column has numeric data in it. And then to see the sales of each product ID, we can grab product ID and click and drag it to the rows area. So we have done this before when we were just creating standard pivot tables. But let's take a look at our report here. We can see the total sales for each product ID, but we don't know the names of these products. For example, let's take a look at product ID P101. If we go back and open up our PowerPivot window, and then go to our product data, we can see that the product ID of P101 is a pencil, and P201 is tape, and so on. But you might not know that just by looking at the product ID. But since we have created the relationship between the sales data and the product data, and using product ID as the unique identifier, we can add the product name to our pivot table. So let's get back into Excel. And over here in our pivot table fields, underneath product data, we can click and drag the product name to our rows area. Now we can see that the product ID P101 is pencil and P201 is tape. But if you don't want to see the product ID and just see the product name, we can just uncheck product ID. And now our pivot table shows the total sales for each product name. But the only way we can make this happen is to create a data model and establish relationships between these two tables so we could grab data from both of these tables to include them in our report. So this was a basic example of how we can create a pivot table based off our data model. And in the next video, we'll see a few more examples and also add KPIs, which stands for Key Performance Indicators, to our pivot table. So for this video, we will be discussing what are key performance indicators and how they can benefit. So key performance indicators, KPIs for short, are just a visual measure of performance. So basically, they gauge the performance of a value against a target value. And KPIs just help with the visual representation when it comes time to measuring data. So to start adding KPIs to this pivot table, the first thing that we have to do is create some measures within our data model. And to create measures, we have to go back inside of our PowerPivot window. So let's click the PowerPivot tab, and then we can select either Measures or Manage. I'm going to select Manage because I think it's a little bit easier to see and understand which data we are applying the measures to. So if we click Manage, we can come down and select the sales data, and then any cell that's below this line is where we can insert calculations or measures. For example, let's say that we wanted to get a distinct count of all the product IDs within this data table. So if we select this cell that's underneath this line, but still within the product ID column, we can insert a calculation. And we can do that by coming up to the calculations group. And if we click this drop down next to auto sum, we can insert the calculation that we want to perform. So in this case, we want to count how many unique product IDs are within this column. So what we need to do is select distinct count, and then up here in our formula bar, it shows that it inserted the function of distinct count for the product ID. And if we move our cursor between the product ID column and the units sold column, we can click and drag to increase the size of this column. So down here in our calculation, it shows that we have a total of 10 unique product IDs. Although that this measure is valuable to know, we can't really apply KPIs to the distinct count of product IDs within our pivot table. But a good measure to track would be the amount of units sold per product. So let's select the cell within the units sold column, and then we can apply a calculation here to sum the amount of units sold. So we need to come back to our calculations group, and we can just click auto sum. And if we expand the width of our column, we can see that the total amount of units sold is 1,055. So that's how we can create measures within our data model. And measures are needed to create KPIs. So now we can go back to our Excel workbook, and if we look at our pivot table fields, we will see two new fields added to our sales data. We have distinct count of product ID and sum of units sold. And this FX icon symbolizes that this field is a measure. But we can use these measures inside of our pivot table. So let's uncheck total sales and then check sum of units sold too. So now we are using that measure inside of our pivot table. And now we are ready to apply KPIs to this measure. So if we come up to our ribbon, we can select KPIs and then click New KPI. In the first box, we need to select the measure that we want to apply the KPI to, and since we have sum of units sold within our pivot table, we need to click this drop-down and select sum of units sold to. And then in the next section, we can define a target value so we can see how well the units sold for each product is doing in relation to our target value. Currently, our target value is measuring in percentages. If we want to specify a certain amount for our target value, we can select absolute value. So let's say that our target value for the amount of units sold for each product is 100. We can select this box and type in 100. Now in our little thresholds diagram, we can see that our target is placed in the green. So if the units sold for our product is above 80, it will be in the green, and if it's between 40 and 80, it would be in the yellow, and anything below 40 will be in the red. And then we can select any icon style that we want to place inside of our report. I'm just going to keep the default selected and then click OK. Well, our pivot table just put 1s, 0s, and -1s inside of our report instead of the green, yellow, and red indicators. So to fix this, we can come over to our pivot table fields, and then we can select the drop-down next to this stoplight icon, symbolizing that this is a KPI, and then we can just uncheck status and then check status back again. So now we have these indicators inside of our pivot table, and it's very easy to tell how our products are selling in relation to our target value. So we can come over to our report and instantly tell that the calculator sales are good, the Ethernet cables are doing okay, and then the keyboard sales are down quite a bit. So let's do another example. Let's track the sum of units sold by the city instead of by the product name. So if we come over to our pivot table fields, we can deselect product name, and then we need to select the city within the customer data table. Well, if we scroll down, our customer data is not there because currently we are only displaying the active fields. If we select all fields, now we are able to see our customer data table. And then we can select our city and drag it to our rows area. Now the reason why I wanted to do another example is to show that our KPI values remain the same. So if we come up to our ribbon and click KPIs, Manage KPIs, and then select Sum of Units Sold To, and if we click Edit, we can see that our target value remained at 100 and our thresholds remained at 40 and 80. So if you ever change the fields inside your pivot table, like what we just did, we went from summing the units sold by the product name to summing the units sold by the city. And you might have different target values depending on the fields that you have in your report. And if that's the case, you would want to open up this KPI window and edit your values. So that's how we can add KPIs to our pivot tables to easily visualize and gauge the performance of our data.